In every corner of history, there lies a legend, but none burns brighter or darker than the American West. It was a land of dreams and dust, of gold and blood, of cowboys, outlaws, and nations that refused to die. From the thundering herds of buffalo that once covered the plains, to the silent prayers of the Lakota beneath endless skies, from the roar of revolvers and the whistle of steam engines, to the voices of women, slaves, and wanderers carving new lives from wilderness. This is not just the story of a country. It is the story of human will, how it conquers, destroys, rebuilds, and remembers. On History Teller YT, we ride back into that forgotten age, where myths were born, heroes fell, and the land itself became legend. You'll walk through ghost towns buried in dust, stand beside Sitting Bull at Little Bighorn, and ride the last trail with cowboys who never looked back. You'll see the truth behind the Hollywood glare, and hear the real voices that shaped a nation from fire and faith. This is the untamed heart of America. This is the American West. Cowboys, outlaws, and native resistance. A story of survival, of conquest, and of spirit, told as it was lived and remembered as it deserves. So saddle up, listener. The frontier awaits, and its echoes still call your name. The 19th century dawned upon a restless nation. From the crowded harbors of the East to the misty edges of the Mississippi, Americans dreamed of an open horizon that seemed to whisper freedom. They believed God Himself had written their destiny across the vast, untamed wilderness beyond. Manifest destiny. They called it a divine mission to spread civilization, democracy, and progress from sea to shining sea. Yet beneath this grand idea lay ambition, greed, and displacement. The West was not empty. It was home to vibrant nations, Lakota, Apache, Comanche, Cherokee, whose ancestors had lived there for centuries. But maps drawn in Washington ignored these people, marking lands as frontier as if waiting to be claimed. Pioneers hitched their wagons, packing dreams of farmland, fortune, and faith. Artists and poets painted the journey as a sacred crusade, while politicians framed it as America's moral duty. But nature was indifferent to their faith. The plains were harsh, rivers unpredictable, and the Rockies unyielding. Still, the promise of endless land pulled them forward like a magnet. Every step westward meant a clash between hope and hunger, settlers and natives, dream and destruction. The expansion transformed not just geography, but the nation's very soul, birthing legends of courage while sowing seeds of tragedy. The story of the American frontier began not with cowboys' guns, but with a collective belief that destiny could be conquered by will alone. To the American imagination, the frontier became more than territory. It was an idea, a living myth. Newspapers of the 1830s spoke of the West as a blank canvas for ambition. For poor farmers, it meant escape from debt. For immigrants, it meant a second chance. For idealists, it symbolized the purest form of liberty, life unchained from governments, kings, or crowded cities. Yet freedom came at a price. With every mile of wagon trail, the wild was tamed, forests cut, rivers diverted, native trails erased. The frontier spirit celebrated human triumph over nature, but in truth, it was a fragile victory. The land resisted. Blizzards buried families, droughts starved cattle, and loneliness haunted the hearts of settlers. Still, in the silence of the open plains, people felt reborn. They built towns from dust, churches from logs, and dreams from sheer endurance. Men and women who had never owned a foot of land back east now stood beneath endless skies and called it theirs. This sense of independence forged a new kind of American, self-reliant, daring, suspicious of authority. It gave birth to the archetype of the cowboy, the drifter, the outlaw, figures who embodied both the beauty and the brutality of freedom. The frontier, in myth and memory, became America's mirror, reflecting its best hopes and darkest sins. Life on the frontier was a gamble with fate. Families traveling west faced 1,000 unseen dangers. Roads turned to mud, food spoiled, disease stalked the camps. Mothers buried children in shallow graves along the trails, marking them with wooden crosses that the wind soon erased. Men fought off wolves and despair in equal measure. Letters home, written by flickering lamplight, spoke of endless toil, but also quiet triumphs. A cabin raised, a field cleared, a child's laughter under the prairie moon. The settlers' courage was not born of arrogance, but necessity. They had burned bridges behind them. There was no going back. The land tested every virtue: patience, faith, love. Neighbors were few, but community was everything. When a house burned, all hands rebuilt it. When sickness struck, the nearest doctor might be 100 miles away. So faith and folklore filled the void. Amid hardship, songs were sung, stories told, tales of buffalo herds, of thunder gods, of dreams carried by the wind. Slowly, the wilderness became home. The frontier was no longer a border, but a living space of struggle and hope, where humanity learned humility before nature. And from this crucible would rise the West's enduring legends of cowboys, natives, and outlaws, all children of the same wild earth. By the 1840s, the hunger for land had reached fever pitch. Thousands of families packed their lives into wooden wagons, setting their sights on the Oregon Territory, a land whispered to be fertile, rich, and free. What awaited them was a journey of nearly 2,000 miles across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. The Oregon Trail became both a road of dreams and a corridor of death. The trail began at Independence, Missouri, and wound its way through endless prairies, across raging rivers, over the Rocky Mountains, and into the green valleys of the Pacific Northwest. The trip could take 6 months, 6 months of exhaustion, fear, and fragile hope. Each morning, the caravan rose before dawn. Oxen were yoked, fires rekindled, and prayers whispered to the cold wind. But the trail showed no mercy. Storms drowned wagons. Diseases like cholera swept through camps, and river crossings swallowed both cattle and children. Graves dotted the path like milestones of sacrifice. Yet still they pressed on. Why? Because the East felt suffocating, land too crowded, wages too low, opportunity too distant. The West, in contrast, seemed infinite. For every tragedy, there was a triumph, a sunrise over new horizons, a baby's cry in a wagon, a glimpse of Oregon's distant forests shimmering in hope. The Oregon Trail was more than a route. It was America's great test of endurance, where faith and fear rode side by side under the open sky. The road west was not a highway. It was a living battlefield between nature and human will. Dust hung thick in the air, turning faces gray and lips dry. The sound of creaking wheels and lowing oxen echoed across the plains, day after day, month after month. Travelers faced endless monotony punctuated by sudden terror, stampeding bison, rattlesnakes under blankets, or arrows whistling from unseen hills. Yet despite danger, a strange community spirit flourished. Every wagon train became a miniature world governed by rules, cooperation, and the unspoken law of survival. Men took turns riding ahead to scout for water. Women cooked meals, mended clothes, and nursed the sick. Children gathered wildflowers, unaware they were walking through history. Nights were filled with campfire songs and whispered fears. Sometimes the stars seemed close enough to touch, a heavenly reminder of why they had come this far. Diaries from those journeys speak of aching beauty, prairies glowing gold under sunset, herds of antelope crossing rivers, the lonely sound of wolves howling across the plains. But also, they speak of loss, of fever, hunger, and heartbreak. The wagon roads carved not just paths through wilderness, but deep emotional scars into the hearts of those who traveled them. The frontier demanded everything: strength, faith, and sometimes life itself. But for those who survived, it offered something no one could buy: the chance to begin again. When the first settlers reached their destinations, they found not paradise, but a wilderness waiting to be tamed. Small camps sprang up beside rivers and trade routes, evolving into dusty frontier towns with names like Independence, Dodge City, and Deadwood. They were built from wood, sweat, and stubbornness, each a fragile outpost of civilization surrounded by endless wild. Life here was raw and immediate. A blacksmith's hammer rang beside the laughter of saloon girls. Preachers shared streets with gamblers and gunslingers. The smell of whiskey, horses, and dust filled the air. Every man carried a weapon. Every woman carried a secret. Law was often nothing more than a man with a badge and a fast hand. Justice was quick, sometimes brutal, and survival meant watching your back. But these towns pulsed with life: dance halls, general stores, newspapers, and dreams. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, China, and Mexico worked side by side, shaping a new America out of chaos. Farmers tilled the hard soil. Merchants traded hides and tools, while native tribes watched from afar, uncertain whether these newcomers came to coexist or to conquer. Each log cabin and saloon was a statement that humanity could build something permanent even on shifting sands. The frontier towns became symbols of both progress and peril, where ambition met anarchy, and every dawn promised a new beginning. Out here, survival wasn't just a matter of strength. It was about the courage to believe that home could exist at the edge of the world. It began on a cold January morning in 1848 near the small settlement of Coloma, California. James W. Marshall, a carpenter working for a man named John Sutter, bent down to inspect something glittering in the shallow waters of the American River. It was gold, raw, shining, unmistakable gold. That tiny discovery, no bigger than a fingernail, would ignite one of the greatest human migrations in history. Within months, whispers of gold in California spread like wildfire across the nation. Newspapers screamed of instant riches, and desperate men abandoned farms, families, and cities, chasing a dream that gleamed brighter than reason itself. They called themselves the 49ers, and they came from everywhere: New York, Boston, the Carolinas, Mexico, Chile, and even China. Some trudged across deserts and mountains. Others sailed around Cape Horn or crossed jungles through Panama. What awaited them was not the paradise of easy fortune, but a brutal test of endurance. The camps were crowded, diseases rampant, and justice rare. The law of gold was simple: the strong took, the weak lost. Yet hope persisted like a fever. Even those who failed to strike gold clung to the belief that tomorrow's sunrise could change everything. That was the cruel beauty of the gold rush. It promised freedom, but demanded your soul. The discovery at Sutter's Mill was not just a spark of wealth. It was the spark that transformed America forever, expanding its borders, reshaping its identity, and birthing legends of greed, glory, and human grit. By 1849, California was no longer a quiet frontier. It had become a thunderstorm of ambition. Ships clogged San Francisco Bay, their crews deserting to join the rush inland. Makeshift towns mushroomed overnight. Wooden shacks, gambling tents, and saloons where whiskey flowed like water. Men who had never lifted a shovel before now clawed at the earth from dawn to dusk, driven by gold fever that blinded judgment and burned morality. Some struck it rich in a single day. Others dug for years and died penniless, their dreams buried beneath the same soil they had worshipped. The gold fields were chaotic theaters of human extremes. Laughter and murder, faith and betrayal, brotherhood and bloodshed. Fights over claims were common. A single nugget could spark a deadly gunfight. The miners lived by rough codes of justice, forming vigilante groups when law could not reach them. Among the dust and sweat, entire cultures collided. Chinese laborers, Latin American prospectors, free black settlers, and European immigrants all sought the same elusive promise. But prejudice, violence, and exclusion shadowed the camps. Native Californians suffered most, their land stolen, their villages destroyed, their people enslaved or massacred in the name of progress. Yet the fever would not stop. By 1852, more than 300,000 people had poured into California, reshaping its destiny. The gold rush created cities, birthed millionaires, and turned a wild frontier into the heartbeat of the new American dream. But it also revealed the nation's endless hunger for wealth, no matter the cost. Gold built empires, but it also destroyed lives. For every man who struck fortune, thousands lost everything. The once green hills of California were left scarred and hollowed by relentless mining. Rivers ran thick with silt and mercury, poisoned by the machines of progress. Forests were cut down to feed the insatiable hunger for timber and fuel. But the greatest wounds were human. Native tribes who had lived in balance with nature for centuries found themselves hunted like animals, their lands claimed under laws written by strangers. Diseases brought by settlers swept through indigenous villages, killing thousands. In the name of civilization, entire nations were erased. Meanwhile, fortune seekers from around the world found themselves prisoners of their own ambition. Violence was constant, duels over claims, robberies in the mountains, lynchings under moonlight. San Francisco grew rich and wild, a city of gamblers, dreamers, and ghosts. Brothels thrived beside banks, and preachers preached in the shadow of gunmen. Yet amid the chaos, something larger took root, the birth of modern California. Railroads were built, ports expanded, and the region's gold wealth financed industries across America. The fever faded, but its legacy endured. The gold rush transformed a remote Western territory into a global crossroads, a symbol of both human ambition and human cost. It was the West's original sin and its greatest triumph, proof that the pursuit of fortune could move mountains, even as it buried the souls who dug beneath them. Long before the stars of the American flag reached the Pacific, the land was alive with nations whose stories ran deeper than rivers and older than mountains. The Great Plains stretched endlessly, a sea of grass beneath a sky that never ended. This was the home of the Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Apache, people bound not by borders but by balance with the earth. They called the land their mother, the buffalo their brother, the wind their guide. Their societies were not primitive, as settlers later claimed, but profoundly sophisticated, built on honor, community, and spiritual law. Warriors trained not only for battle, but for responsibility. Women held authority as life givers, healers, and keepers of culture. Every campfire told a story, every hunt a ceremony. The Lakotas sang to the rising sun, asking it to bless their path. The Cheyenne believed dreams were bridges to the spirit world. The Apache moved silently through desert canyons, knowing every shadow by heart. To them, the land was sacred, not something to be owned, but to be respected. They saw the buffalo as a gift, never to be wasted, never to be taken without prayer. But as whispers of white expansion grew louder, dark omens stirred on the horizon. The nations of the plains could sense the coming storm, a storm of men who measured the earth not in spirit, but in acres. And though they did not yet know its full fury, the Great Plains were about to become the stage of their greatest trial. The battle to remain free in a world that no longer understood what freedom truly meant. To understand the world of the native nations is to enter a universe where everything breathes together. The grass, the sky, the rivers, even the stones. All were alive, each connected in a great circle of being. This was not superstition. It was philosophy, an understanding that harmony with nature was essential to survival. The Lakota spoke of Wakantanka, the Great Spirit, who flowed through all things. The Apache prayed to the mountain spirits who guarded them. The Cheyenne danced for rain, believing the drumbeat echoed the heartbeat of the world. Every ritual, every song, every feather carried meaning. In their vision of life, no man stood above another, not even above the animals. To take life, whether a deer or a buffalo, required humility and gratitude. Children were taught not through punishment, but through story. Tales of coyote, eagle, and bear that taught courage, cleverness, and respect. Elders held the wisdom of centuries, passing it from tongue to tongue, unbroken by written words. They believed time was not a line, but a circle, where birth and death were not opposites, but partners in an eternal dance. To destroy one part of the circle, the land, the spirit, or the tribe, was to wound the whole. So when the white man came with fences, rifles, and greed, it was not just the people being attacked. It was the very balance of the world. The natives stood not only for themselves, but for the sacred web that bound all life together. And that made their struggle more than resistance. It was a fight for the soul of the earth. The first encounters between native nations and white settlers began with curiosity, not conflict. The newcomers were strange, pale-skinned, iron-handed, carrying thunder sticks and diseases unseen before. At first, many tribes welcomed them with cautious hospitality, trading furs for knives, horses, and rifles. But soon, kindness was met with betrayal. Treaties signed in smoke and trust were broken by ink and greed. The U.S. government promised land, for as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers shall flow. Yet within years, settlers flooded those same lands, tearing up treaties like leaves in the wind. The Sioux watched as their sacred hunting grounds were carved into farms. The Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek were forced on deadly marches westward. The Trail of Tears, where thousands perished from hunger and cold. The Apache saw their mountains invaded by miners. The Comanche faced soldiers who burned villages and slaughtered their horses. Missionaries arrived with Bibles, declaring that salvation required forgetting one's ancestors. Children were taken from their families, forced to wear foreign clothes, forbidden to speak their own languages. The harmony of generations began to crack under the weight of conquest. But even then, the spirit of resistance burned bright. Warriors like Tecumseh, Osceola, and Geronimo rose to defend their people. Councils of elders gathered under the stars, vowing that no matter how powerful the invaders became, they would never own the heartbeat of the land. The storm had begun, and the native nations would soon face the might of an empire that believed destiny was its weapon. Yet in every broken promise, in every fallen warrior, the world would hear a single echo, that freedom cannot be conquered, only delayed. After the smoke of the Civil War drifted away, the land between Texas and the Great Plains opened like an endless ocean of grass. Millions of longhorn cattle roamed wild, their horns stretching like scythes against the sky. And from the ashes of war rose a new American figure, the cowboy. He was part laborer, part legend, born from the dust of hardship and the rhythm of hooves. His job was simple yet brutal: to herd thousands of cattle across hundreds of miles of wilderness, driving them from ranches in Texas to railway towns in Kansas, where beef-hungry cities of the East waited. Days began before sunrise. Cowboys saddled their Mustangs, checked their lariats, and followed the foreman's call into the rolling dawn. They ate beans and biscuits cooked over open fires, slept under the stars with saddles for pillows, and rode for weeks through storms, rivers, and blazing heat. A man's worth wasn't measured by money but by endurance, how long he could ride, rope, and survive. The work demanded skill, guiding cattle through floods, calming stampedes, and defending herds from rustlers or wolves. There were few comforts and fewer laws. Yet the life, for many, meant freedom. Freedom for bosses, from cities, from rules. Most cowboys were not white heroes as Hollywood later imagined. They were Mexican vaqueros, freed black men, native drifters, and poor immigrants who shared the saddle and the hardship equally. They invented techniques, roping, branding, herding, drawn from centuries of Spanish and indigenous tradition. The cowboy was not born from myth. He was carved by sweat, sun, and solitude. On the open range, under skies wide as forever, they became the heartbeat of a new America, tough, lonely, proud, and forever chasing horizons that could never be caught. As railroads crept westward and cities demanded meat, the cattle industry exploded. Texas herds, millions strong, grazed freely on public land. But cattle without marks were wealth without ownership, and so came the brand, a symbol seared into hide, a fiery signature of survival and property. Branding day turned into ritual. Smoke filled the air, iron hissed, and calves bawled as ranch hands pressed glowing metal to skin. Each brand told a story, a family, a ranch, a reputation. And in a world where law traveled slower than the wind, branding was the difference between order and chaos. Cattle drives became the arteries of the frontier economy. Trails like the Chisholm Trail, the Goodnight-Loving Trail, and the Western Trail carried millions of cattle northward to markets in Abilene, Dodge City, and beyond. The drive could last 3 months across rivers, deserts, and Indian territory. Stampedes were constant nightmares. One clap of thunder, one rattlesnake's hiss, and 1,000 beasts could charge into madness, crushing men and destroying fortunes overnight. Cowboys learned to sing to the herds under moonlight, calming them with gentle voices and harmonica tunes. But where there was wealth, there was theft. Rustlers haunted the trails, stealing cattle in the night, changing brands with a hot iron, or ambushing drives at remote crossings. Some were desperate drifters, others were organized gangs. Ranchers hired gunmen to protect their stock, and soon, bullets became a new language of property. The cattle drive became not only a business, but a test of nerve and loyalty. Men who survived it carried scars the rest of their lives. Proof that the frontier rewarded only the bold and buried the careless. By the 1870s, the cowboy had become more than a worker. He was a symbol, a moving frontier between civilization and wildness, between the dream of freedom and the danger that came with it. As the years passed, dime novelists and Eastern journalists transformed the working cowboy into a hero of myth. In smoky saloons and city bookshops, stories spread of fearless riders battling bandits, saving maidens, and taming the West with six-shooters. The real cowboy, weary and sunburnt, barely recognized himself in these pages. In truth, most were underpaid, overworked, and forgotten. Their days were filled with dust, disease, and danger, not glory. They fought boredom more often than gunfights. They risked their lives for $20 or $30 a month, with little more than a horse, a hat, and a sense of pride to call their own. Yet myth and reality blended until the cowboy became something larger, a national symbol of independence and endurance. His hat, boots, and lasso became America's armor, his silence its code of honor. Even as barbed wire fenced the open range and railroads replaced the long drives, the cowboy spirit refused to die. It lived on in rodeos, in country songs, in the swagger of every man who called himself free. But the truth beneath the legend was far more human. Cowboys were not conquerors. They were survivors, bridge builders between two worlds, living in the twilight of wilderness and civilization. Many were former slaves seeking dignity, or indigenous men riding the same lands once hunted by their ancestors. Some were Mexican vaqueros, whose horsemanship shaped every tradition of the range. Together, they created a shared culture, one that spoke through grit and silence. The myth of the cowboy might have been written in ink, but the truth was written in sweat. And as the century turned, the cowboy rode not just into the sunset, but into immortality, a symbol of the American spirit, half truth, half legend, but wholly unforgettable. In the turbulent years after the Civil War, when the South lay broken and its people haunted by defeat, chaos gave birth to legends. Among them rose a name whispered with both fear and fascination, Jesse James. Born in Missouri, Jesse was a preacher's son turned Confederate guerrilla, shaped by blood and vengeance. During the war, he fought under Bloody Bill Anderson, riding in raids that blurred the line between soldier and murderer. When peace came, Jesse found no peace in the ashes of Reconstruction. The fields were ruined, the laws rewritten, and the South humiliated. So he and his brother Frank James turned their rebellion into banditry. They began robbing banks and trains, not for greed alone, but as Jesse claimed, for revenge against the Yankee oppressors and the wealthy elites who exploited the broken South. In 1869, they struck their first bank in Gallatin, Missouri, killing a cashier and escaping in a legend. Newspapers turned Jesse into a folk hero, the Robin Hood of the West, a man who stole from the rich and defied corrupt power. But behind the myth lay blood. Innocent lives were lost in every raid. His gang, the James Younger Gang, spread terror across the Midwest, their fame feeding on both bullets and lies. Jesse was cunning, daring, and deeply charismatic. He wrote letters to the press defending his cause, twisting words as skillfully as he wielded a Colt revolver. Yet his story ended not in triumph, but betrayal. In 1882, as he adjusted a picture frame in his home, one of his own men, Robert Ford, shot him from behind, ending the outlaw's reign and sealing his immortality. In death, Jesse James became more myth than man, a symbol of rebellion against authority, born from war, greed, and the restless spirit of the American frontier. If Jesse James was the dark heart of the post-war South, Billy the Kid was the restless soul of the Southwest. His real name was Henry McCarty, but history remembers him by his alias, a name that carried the wildness of the frontier itself. Orphaned young, Billy grew up in poverty, drifting through New Mexico in the 1870s. He was small, sharp-eyed, and fast, with both a smile and a revolver. By the time he was 16, he had already killed his first man. Yet those who met him often described him as polite, almost gentle, a boy trapped in a world that only respected violence. Billy became infamous during the Lincoln County War, a brutal conflict between rival cattle barons, merchants, and corrupt politicians. The kid chose a side, not for justice, but loyalty. He rode with the Regulators, a vigilante group fighting against the powerful Murphy-Dolan faction. The war turned New Mexico into a killing field, and Billy's skill with a gun made him both legend and target. He once boasted he had killed 21 men, one for every year of his life, though the truth was likely fewer. Still, his reputation grew like wildfire, carried by dime novels and fearful whispers. He could vanish into the desert like a shadow, dance at a fiesta one night, and gun down an enemy the next. Lawmen hunted him relentlessly, but the kid seemed untouchable until Sheriff Pat Garrett, a former friend, tracked him down. In 1881, at Fort Sumner, Billy was shot dead, just 21 years old. Yet death did not silence him. The legend of Billy the Kid became the embodiment of youthful defiance, the spirit of a land where law and chaos were indistinguishable. He was not a hero, nor a villain. He was a reflection of the West itself, wild, misunderstood, and unforgettable. In a world of guns, saloons, and endless dust, it was easy to forget that women, too, carved their names into outlaw history. The frontier was not only a man's domain, it was a crucible that tested everyone. Among the most notorious was Belle Starr, known as the Bandit Queen. Born Myra Bell Shirley in Missouri, she grew up amid gunfire and rebellion. Sharp, ambitious, and defiant, Belle learned early how to survive in a world where power belonged to men with guns. She rode with gangs, harbored fugitives, and was rumored to have been close to both Jesse James and the younger brothers. Dressed in velvet and lace, but armed with pistols, she became a symbol of independence and danger, a woman who played by no one's rules but her own. Then there was Pearl Hart, who robbed a stagecoach in Arizona in 1899, one of the last great crimes of the frontier era. She claimed she did it to feed her family, and though she was captured, her charm turned her trial into a spectacle. Crowds gathered not to condemn her, but to marvel at her courage. Women like Belle and Pearl shattered the image of the helpless pioneer wife. They rode, fought, and bled like men, yet faced harsher judgment for it. Outlaw women represented something larger than crime. They embodied rebellion against the rigid order of society. The West justice system was equally ruthless. Quick trials, public hangings, and vigilante mobs who believed death was cleaner than mercy. But even under the gallows, some smiled, defiant to the end. In a land ruled by violence and survival, justice was often a matter of perspective. The outlaw, whether man or woman, became both villain and hero, proof that in the Wild West, freedom and lawlessness rode the same horse, and every legend was paid for in blood. In the heart of the Arizona desert, where dust choked the wind and greed ruled the horizon, a town named Tombstone rose from the silver mines. It was 1881, a place where whiskey flowed faster than law, and every man carried a gun. Amid the gamblers, thieves, and drifters walked a man whose name would echo forever, Wyatt Earp. He wasn't born a legend. He was a drifter, a gambler, a part-time marshal, chasing order in a world allergic to it. Alongside his brothers Virgil and Morgan, and his loyal friend Doc Holliday, Wyatt became a symbol of law carved from dust and danger. Tombstone was divided. The Earp brothers stood for the law, while the Cowboys, led by Ike Clanton and the McClory brothers, lived by their own code of violence. For months, tensions smoldered between them, each side daring the other to draw first. It all erupted on October 26, 1881, in a narrow alley near the OK Corral. In 30 seconds, 30 shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead: Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton, while Wyatt and his allies walked away, battered but alive. The gunfight at the OK Corral became the most famous shootout in American history, though no one then could have known it. The newspapers painted Wyatt as both hero and murderer, lawman and outlaw. To some, he represented justice; to others, vengeance. What's undeniable is that the battle symbolized the frontier's eternal paradox. To enforce the law, one often had to break it. Wyatt lived long after the West was tamed, dying quietly in Los Angeles in 1929. Yet his legend never died. It grew, larger than life, standing as the eternal sheriff of America's restless spirit, the man who dared to draw when the world was still wild. Before Wyatt Earp's star rose over the frontier, another name ruled the saloons and stories of the West: James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok. To his enemies, he was a killer. To his admirers, a hero. He wore twin, ivory-handled revolvers on his hips and a calmness in his eyes that made even the boldest hesitate. Hickok was not just a gunfighter. He was a gambler, scout, soldier, and showman, a man who turned his own life into legend before anyone else could. Born in Illinois, Wild Bill drifted west as a young man, working as a stagecoach driver and lawman in Kansas. His first fame came from a deadly shootout in 1865 when he faced David Tutt in Springfield, Missouri. The two men squared off in the dusty street, and Hickok's bullet struck true from 75 yards. The first classic quick-draw duel of the West. Newspapers spread the tale like wildfire, calling him the deadliest man with a six-gun. But Hickok was more than a killer. He was an icon of frontier justice. While he served as Marshal of Abilene, he tried to keep order among cowboys, drunks, and outlaws who filled the saloons after every cattle drive. Behind the legend was a man haunted by his own fame. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and grew blind from illness. By 1876, he had wandered to Deadwood, Dakota Territory, where fortune seekers filled the hills with greed. On August 2nd of that year, while playing poker, Hickok was shot in the back of the head by a coward named Jack McCall. The cards he held, 2 aces and 2 eights, became known forever as the dead man's hand. In death, Wild Bill Hickok became the blueprint for every Western hero to come. Noble yet doomed, brave yet tragic, a man who lived by the gun and died facing its inevitable truth. In the West, no one escapes fate. In a Wild West, justice was often no more than a heartbeat away from chaos. Towns rose overnight, and laws followed much later. Judges were scarce, jails small, and tempers short. Into this vacuum stepped the lawmen, flawed, fearless individuals trying to impose order on the edge of civilization. Men like Bat Masterson, Pat Garrett, and Bass Reeves carried stars that shone as both shields and targets. Reeves, a former enslaved man turned deputy U.S. Marshal, captured more than 3,000 criminals across the Indian Territory, a living testament that justice had no color when courage took the saddle. But justice in the frontier was rarely clean. For every lawman, there was a gunslinger, a man who answered to no one but his own code. Some, like Clay Allison or John Wesley Hardin, killed more men than they could remember, sometimes for insult, sometimes for sport. Others, like Tom Horn, worked as hired guns, blurring the line between deputy and assassin. Out here, reputation was currency, and fear was the only law that always worked. The people, too, took the law into their own hands. Vigilante mobs dragged suspects from cells, hangman's ropes swinging in the desert sun. Trials were quick, verdicts quicker. A man's life could depend on a rumor whispered in a saloon. Yet through this chaos, the frontier shaped its own sense of morality. Harsh, direct, but strangely just. It was a world where good and evil were not opposites, but neighbors, sharing the same whiskey bottle, the same gun barrel, the same sunrise. And when the smoke cleared, the legends of these lawmen and gunslingers became the backbone of America's mythology. Men who stood alone between order and oblivion, writing justice with bullets in the Book of the Wild. In the mid-19th century, America stood divided not only by ideology and war, but by distance itself. From the bustling ports of New York to the gold fields of California stretched thousands of miles of wilderness. Mountains, rivers, and deserts that swallowed months of travel and countless lives. The dream of uniting the nation by steel became more than ambition. It became destiny. Thus began one of the greatest engineering marvels of the age, the Transcontinental Railroad. Authorized by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862, the project aimed to stitch the torn fabric of the nation together after the Civil War. Two companies were given the monumental task: the Union Pacific building westward from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific pushing east from Sacramento, California. The land between them was untamed and unforgiving, home to buffalo herds, towering mountains, and native nations who saw the coming of the Iron Horse as a death omen. Progress was slow and perilous. Workers battled heat, snow, starvation, and attacks. Supplies ran out. Money nearly collapsed. Yet the work continued, day after day, mile after mile. The sound of hammers striking steel became the heartbeat of a transforming nation. Towns rose along the tracks, bringing merchants, gamblers, and thieves. Farmers followed, carving civilization into wilderness. And with every rail laid, the old frontier shrank. On May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah, the final golden spike was driven. The East and West were at last united. The train whistle echoed across the plains like a hymn to progress, and a dirge for the old world that was vanishing beneath it. Behind the triumph of the railroad lay a story of immense human suffering, one that history too often whispers instead of shouts. The backbone of the Central Pacific Railroad was not forged by wealthy investors or politicians, but by the hands of thousands of Chinese laborers. Recruited from Guangdong and southern China, these men came seeking work and survival after famine and civil unrest devastated their homeland. When white workers abandoned the job, the Chinese stayed. They worked longer hours for less pay and in conditions that bordered on impossible. They carved tunnels through the Sierra Nevada mountains, blasting granite with black powder and nitroglycerin. Their bodies often buried in snow from avalanches or lost in explosions. Temperatures plunged below zero in winter, soared above 100 in summer. Many died of exhaustion, disease, or accidents, but their labor never faltered. They hung from cliffs in wicker baskets, chiseling rock by hand while suspended above sheer drops. Without them, the railroad would not have been completed. Yet when the golden spike was driven, no Chinese worker was invited to the ceremony. History erased their faces, even as their sweat held the rails in place. Discrimination awaited them at every turn. Laws barred them from citizenship, from owning property, even from burial beside whites. Still, they endured. They built communities in Chinatowns along the tracks, preserving their traditions amid prejudice. Theirs was a story of silent strength. Men who helped forge America's destiny, only to be written out of its glory. Today, the echo of their hammers remains not just a sound of industry, but a reminder of the invisible hands that built the spine of a nation. Where the railroad went, life followed, and where it stopped, cities were born. The iron tracks were not just roads of steel. They were veins through which the lifeblood of modern America began to flow. Tiny settlements along the routes blossomed into booming towns overnight. Cheyenne, Abilene, Laramie, and Dodge City emerged from the dust, built around depots and water towers. Merchants arrived with goods from the east, saloons with whiskey from Kentucky, and dreamers with maps in their pockets. The West, once isolated and endless, was now connected, its pulse tied to the whistle of a train. But along with prosperity came corruption. Rail barons grew richer than kings, controlling land, politics, and even laws. Native tribes, once the masters of the plains, saw their hunting grounds sliced apart by steel and settlement. The buffalo, sacred to many nations, were slaughtered in their millions to clear the way for trains and cattle. Progress came at a price, and it was often paid by those with the least power to resist. Still, the railroad transformed the West into something new. Goods moved faster, letters crossed continents in days instead of months, and families could travel from coast to coast in comfort. The train became a symbol of modernity, a bridge between worlds. Children watched in awe as it thundered by, its smoke trailing like a comet across the endless prairie sky. It carried hope and destruction in equal measure, a mechanical beast whose arrival marked the end of isolation and the beginning of America's next great age. The towns it left behind became legends, monuments to a time when the frontier's silence was broken forever by the cry of the iron horse. As the railroads carved through the heart of the plains, the old world of the native nations began to fade, not through war alone, but through slow suffocation. The buffalo, once numbering in the tens of millions, were slaughtered to near extinction by hunters who left their carcasses rotting in the sun. Without the buffalo, the Lakotas Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho faced starvation. Yet in their suffering, resistance began to burn brighter. At the center of this defiance stood a man whose wisdom and spirit became legendary. Tatanka Iotake, known to the world as Sitting Bull. Born along the Grand River in what is now South Dakota, Sitting Bull was more than a warrior. He was a visionary. He preached unity among the tribes and the preservation of their way of life against the invading tide of settlers. Let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children, he said, words that echoed like prophecy. Under his leadership, the Sioux resisted treaty violations and fought to defend the sacred Black Hills. Stolen after gold was discovered there in 1874. The U.S. government demanded the tribes surrender their lands. They refused. Amid despair, a new spiritual movement arose, the Ghost Dance. It promised that the white man's world would fade and the buffalo would return if the people danced in faith. For a time, hope flickered like firelight on a cold night, but fear twisted that hope into tragedy. The U.S. Army saw the Ghost Dance as rebellion. They came with rifles instead of understanding. When Sitting Bull was shot dead in 1890 during an arrest attempt, the dream began to die. His people mourned not only a leader, but an era, the last voice of a free nation silenced by the thunder of an empire that mistook faith for defiance. The summer of 1876, a moment when history seemed to hold its breath. Across the rolling hills of Montana, a coalition of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors gathered beneath the blazing sun. They came not for conquest, but survival, led by Sitting Bull's spiritual guidance and the fierce command of Crazy Horse, the young Oglala war chief, whose courage was legend even among his enemies. Their camp stretched for miles along the Little Bighorn River, unaware that destiny was galloping toward them. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry launched an assault, expecting a small village. Instead, they rode into the largest gathering of native warriors the plains had ever seen, nearly 2,000 strong. Custer, driven by pride and ambition, divided his forces, believing victory was certain. It was a fatal mistake. The warriors surrounded the soldiers in waves, their war cries echoing like thunder. The sky filled with smoke and dust. Rifles cracked. Arrows hissed through the air. Custer and his men fought to the last, but they were overwhelmed. When silence returned, every soldier lay dead, a complete annihilation. The tribes had won their greatest victory, and the white world was stunned. Newspapers called it Custer's last stand, but to the Lakota, it was the Battle of Greasy Grass, a defense of life, not a rebellion. Yet triumph brought no peace. The U.S. government unleashed its full military might in revenge. Villages were burned, herds destroyed, and survivors hunted across the plains. The victory at Little Bighorn became both a symbol of resistance and a prelude to despair. Proof that courage alone could not stop a nation determined to erase an entire way of life. The snow fell thick and silent over South Dakota in December 1890, covering the scars of a dying century. After decades of broken treaties and endless battles, the remaining Lakota people were starving and desperate, driven onto reservations where freedom had turned to captivity. The ghost dance still lingered among them, a fragile hope that the old world might somehow return. But the U.S. Army saw even hope as a threat. On December 29, 1890, soldiers surrounded a camp of Minneconjou Lakota at Wounded Knee Creek. They came to disarm them, but fear and misunderstanding turned the moment into massacre. No one knows who fired the first shot. Some say a deaf Lakota man refused to surrender his rifle. Others say panic rippled through the ranks. What followed was horror. The soldiers opened fire with Hotchkiss guns, mowing down men, women, and children as they tried to flee through the snow. The frozen ground ran red. When it was over, more than 250 Lakota lay dead, half of them women and children. The soldiers later called it a battle. History knows it as a slaughter. The massacre at Wounded Knee marked the end of the Indian Wars, the final, brutal punctuation to centuries of resistance. The spirit of the plains was broken, yet not erased. Songs of mourning became songs of remembrance. Survivors carried the memory like a sacred flame, ensuring that their ancestors' voices would never vanish entirely. Wounded Knee was not just the end of an era. It was the birth of a story, one that would echo through generations, reminding the world that freedom, once stolen, leaves behind ghosts that never stop dancing beneath the western sky. After the guns fell silent and the last warriors laid down their arms, the U.S. government declared the so-called Indian problem solved. But victory for one side meant imprisonment for the other. The native nations, once free riders of the plains, were herded into confined spaces called reservations, small parcels of land often far from their ancestral homes. The government promised these would be safe havens, protected territories where tribes could live in peace, hunt, farm, and rebuild. But behind every treaty was deception. Officials in Washington saw reservations not as protection, but as containment, a tool to erase the old ways and force assimilation into white society. Food rations arrived spoiled or not at all. Promised livestock never came. Soldiers patrolled the borders to prevent families from leaving to hunt or gather. Diseases spread in overcrowded camps, and hunger gnawed at generations. Yet the betrayal cut deeper than flesh. It targeted the spirit. The government's so-called Indian agents, often corrupt, used hunger as leverage to demand obedience. The tribes that had once roamed the plains with freedom beyond measure were now prisoners on their own land, dependent on the very nation that had taken everything. The treaties, written in English, were unreadable to most native leaders, and their terms shifted like desert sand. Each new discovery of gold or farmland brought new lines on the map, shrinking the reservations further. The Great Sioux Reservation, once stretching from the Missouri River to the Black Hills, was hacked into fragments after the 1870s. As long as the rivers flow, the treaties had said, but even rivers, it seemed, could be dammed by greed. The reservation system was not just a policy. It was the quiet continuation of conquest, a way to destroy a people without firing a gun. If the reservation was the body's prison, then the boarding school was the mind's. In the late 19th century, the U.S. government and church missions began an ambitious and brutal experiment to civilize native children by erasing everything that made them who they were. The slogan of the era was chilling: kill the Indian, save the man. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families, often by force, and shipped hundreds of miles away to institutions like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania or Haskell Institute in Kansas. Upon arrival, their hair, a sacred symbol of identity, was cut short. They were given new names, forbidden to speak their native languages, and punished for practicing their traditions. They wore stiff uniforms instead of animal hides and moccasins. Every prayer, song, and story that connected them to their ancestors was branded savage. Days at these schools were filled with rigid discipline and backbreaking labor. Boys learned trades that kept them subservient. Girls were trained for domestic work. Letters home were censored or never sent. Many children died of disease, malnutrition, or despair, their graves marked only by numbers. Yet amid this cruelty, sparks of resistance survived. Some children whispered their languages under blankets at night. Others smuggled traditional songs into Christian hymns. They carried memories of home in silence, preserving what their captors could not touch, the spirit of their people. By the early 1900s, tens of thousands of native children had passed through these schools. Generations grew up caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The scars of that system would echo through families for centuries, shaping identity and pain alike. The boarding schools were not just institutions. They were weapons of erasure, designed to unmake a culture and replace it with obedience. But the human spirit, as history shows, can never be fully rewritten. Life on the reservation became a daily act of endurance. The freedom to hunt, roam, and live by ancestral law was gone, replaced by rations, fences, and surveillance. Yet within those borders, a quiet revolution began, one not of war, but of survival. Tribal councils emerged. Elders continued to tell sacred stories in whispers, and ceremonies persisted in secret under the stars. The government hoped dependency would breed submission, but instead, it gave rise to resilience. For many tribes, identity became both weapon and refuge. The Lakota gathered in sweat lodges. The Navajo wove their history into rugs, and the Hopi danced for rain as their ancestors had done for centuries. These acts, small yet sacred, were forms of defiance, ways to remain human in a world that treated them as relics. Meanwhile, agents and missionaries kept pushing assimilation through farming programs, English education, and forced Christianity. Poverty deepened, alcoholism spread, and despair consumed many. Yet even through this darkness, leaders arose, healers, medicine men, and women who refused to let their culture die. By the early 20th century, reformers in the East began to question the reservation system, recognizing the cruelty it had become. But by then, the damage was immense. Entire generations had grown up behind government fences, their traditions fractured but not forgotten. For the native peoples, identity itself became an act of rebellion. They learned to live in two worlds, the imposed and the inherited, and from that struggle, a new strength was born. The reservation era left deep scars on the soul of America. It was a time of silence and sorrow, but also of quiet courage, the kind that keeps a fire alive even in the coldest winter. For though the native nations had been forced to bow to power, they had not surrendered their spirit. Beneath the weight of captivity, their hearts still beat with the rhythm of the earth. A reminder that no chain can hold a people forever when their identity flows like a river beneath the land. The story of the American West is often told through the clash of gunmen and warriors, but beneath that thunderous legend walked the quiet strength of women, the pioneer mothers and homesteaders who built civilization from dust and prayer. They came west in wagons beside their husbands or followed later, carrying children on their hips and dreams in their hearts. For them, the frontier was not an adventure, it was survival. Each sunrise brought a list of impossible tasks: hauling water from frozen creeks, chopping wood, nursing the sick, sowing, planting, cooking, and guarding against hunger and loneliness. Cabins were small, the distances endless, and help was often days away. Yet these women transformed the wilderness into home. They tended gardens in the shadow of prairie fires, gave birth without doctors, and buried loved ones in ground too hard to dig. Theirs was a strength uncelebrated, silent, steadfast, and sacred. They taught children to read by candlelight using Bibles or newspapers, and they wrote letters to relatives they would never see again, filling the pages with both sorrow and stubborn hope. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised land to anyone willing to work it, and thousands of women claimed property in their own names, an act of quiet rebellion in a world ruled by men. They plowed fields, raised barns, and proved that courage had no gender. Diaries from that time speak of grief and triumph intertwined, of babies lost, crops ruined, yet also of sunsets that made the pain worth bearing. These pioneer women were the architects of endurance. Without them, the frontier would have remained only wilderness and myth. Through their calloused hands, the dream of the West took root, not in glory, but in the humility of survival. Beyond the homestead and the hearth, another kind of frontier woman emerged, the warrior and healer, who carried courage not only in her heart, but in her blood. Among native nations, women had always held sacred authority. They were healers, spiritual leaders, and sometimes fighters, defending their families and traditions with the same ferocity as any warrior. Women like Buffalo Calf Road Woman of the Northern Cheyenne became legends when she fought in the Battle of Rosebud in 1876, riding beside her husband and saving her brother's life in the chaos of war. It was said that her bravery inspired the Cheyenne victory days later at the Battle of Little Bighorn. In other tribes, women carried the knowledge of medicine, herbal cures, sacred songs, and rituals that connected body and spirit. When soldiers destroyed villages and outlawed ceremonies, it was often women who preserved these traditions in secret, whispering them to their daughters so the chain of wisdom would not break. They were the keepers of identity when the world tried to erase it. Among settlers, too, women defied expectation. Frontier nurses and midwives risked their lives to bring health to isolated communities. Figures like Clara Brown, a freed slave who became known as the Angel of the Rockies, built churches, cared for the sick, and reunited families torn apart by slavery. Some women even rode as outlaws and scouts, cross-dressing to escape the confines of gender, carving paths into a world that refused to see their worth. These women were not just witnesses to history, they were its hidden heartbeat. They fought, healed, and led with compassion and ferocity, proving that the strength of the frontier was never only found in the gun. It lived also in the hands that healed wounds and the hearts that refused to break. The West, for all its brutality, became a strange sanctuary for women seeking freedom. In the cities of the East, society dictated every step, every word, every breath a woman could take. But on the frontier, necessity broke those chains. A woman could be anything: a ranch owner, a schoolteacher, a saloon keeper, even a sheriff's deputy. The harshness of the land made equality practical, if not official. There was no room for delicate manners when survival depended on courage. In places like Wyoming and Colorado, women earned rights earlier than anywhere else in America. Wyoming Territory in 1869 became the first to grant women the right to vote. Not as charity, but because frontier life had proven their worth. Women ran businesses, drove stagecoaches, and took up arms when outlaws came. They taught in one-room schools, shaping generations who would build the modern West. Their voices began to echo in newspapers, demanding recognition, education, and justice. Even the saloons and dance halls, women turned survival into art. Performers like Calamity Jane and Annie Oakley blurred the lines between myth and reality, mastering rifles and riding horses with precision that men could only envy. Annie Oakley, especially, became a global icon, a symbol of female skill and independence, proving that a woman could aim as true as any man. The frontier gave women something rare: the right to reinvent themselves. Some found freedom in solitude, others in community, and many in the refusal to be defined by anyone else's rules. They were dreamers, warriors, and builders, shaping the West as much as any pioneer or cowboy. The story of the frontier is not complete without them, for it was their courage, quiet and loud, domestic and defiant, that truly tamed the wilderness. In breaking gender's chains, frontier women redefined what it meant to be free. When most people imagine the Wild West, they see white faces under wide-brimmed hats, riding into crimson sunsets. But the truth, the deeper, forgotten truth, is that nearly 1 in 4 cowboys was black. Their names rarely appeared in dime novels or films, yet their footprints marked every trail of the frontier. They were freedmen, former slaves, and sons of the South who sought new beginnings after the Civil War. With the chains of slavery broken, but prejudice still alive, the open range became their refuge, a place where a man was judged not by his color, but by how well he could ride, rope, and survive. The cattle drives of Texas, Kansas, and New Mexico thrived because of these men. Figures like Nat Love, known as Deadwood Dick, became legends among their peers. Nat was born into slavery in Tennessee, freed as a teenager, and quickly made his way west. He could rope a steer faster than most and shoot straighter than nearly anyone. In his memoirs, he described the frontier as a place where a man's courage was his color. Another was Bose Eichard, a trusted cowboy who rode with the great trailblazer Charles Goodnight. Goodnight later built a monument over Eichard's grave, honoring him as faithful and honest. Black cowboys faced hardships, barred from saloons, refused service in restaurants, and sometimes denied wages, but they carved respect with skill and character. On the trail, equality was forged in necessity. Storms, stampedes, and rustlers didn't discriminate. These men taught songs, riding techniques, and ranching traditions that shaped cowboy culture itself. Even the iconic cowboy style, the lasso, the wide hat, the spurs, came heavily from African, Mexican, and Native influences. Yet history's spotlight dimmed their presence, burying their names beneath Hollywood myth. But their story lives on, a testament to resilience, pride, and the truth that freedom, once earned, must always be defended on horseback and in heart. After the Civil War ended in 1865, thousands of freed African Americans found themselves caught in a cruel paradox, free by law, but unwelcome in the society that had once enslaved them. The southern states trembled with racial violence and broken promises. So, many looked westward, to the land of big skies and bigger chances. The frontier, though harsh and uncertain, offered something no plantation ever could: dignity. Out there, a man could work, earn, and live by his own code. They became cowhands, miners, blacksmiths, and soldiers. Entire communities of black settlers began to rise. Places like Nicodemus, Kansas, founded in 1877 as a haven for freed people seeking a new life. The work was grueling, blistering heat, biting winters, endless miles of open land. But the sense of independence was priceless. On cattle drives, black cowboys often served as trail bosses, cooks, or wranglers, positions that carried both authority and respect. The trail did not erase racism entirely, but it muffled it. Among men facing death daily from floods or stampedes, survival bred mutual respect. Still, life was far from easy. Racist laws followed them west, and many white ranchers refused to hire black workers. Yet, through perseverance, they built legacies that lasted generations. They taught horsemanship to newcomers, trained ranch animals, and brought music and storytelling that blended African rhythm with frontier melody, the earliest seeds of the country blues. Their laughter and labor echoed in the dust of the plains, shaping the true cultural identity of the West. For these men and women, the frontier was not just a new land, it was redemption, a place where for the first time, freedom wasn't a promise written on paper, but something felt in the wind beneath the saddle and across the endless horizon. When the U.S. frontier expanded after the Civil War, the government needed soldiers to patrol it, to protect settlers, railroads, and travelers, in a fight against native resistance. Into this harsh duty stepped the Buffalo Soldiers, 6 regiments of black men formed in 1866. They were veterans, farmers, and freed slaves who saw in a uniform a chance for respect and opportunity in a divided nation. They wore blue coats, carried Springfield rifles, and rode horses across deserts, mountains, and prairies, earning their nickname from the native tribes who admired their courage, and perhaps their thick, dark hair that resembled the mane of the buffalo. The Buffalo Soldiers fought in some of the toughest campaigns in U.S. military history, from Texas and New Mexico to Arizona and the Dakotas. They built roads, guarded stage routes, chased outlaws, and clashed with tribes defending their land. The irony was tragic. Men who had just escaped slavery were now ordered to subdue another oppressed people. Yet within that contradiction, they carved honor. Despite facing poor supplies, inferior horses, and racist officers, the Buffalo Soldiers became renowned for discipline and bravery. Many earned the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award. Beyond combat, they served as peacekeepers and protectors. They escorted settlers, mapped unknown terrain, and even helped establish national parks, some becoming the first rangers of Yosemite and Sequoia. Still, prejudice shadowed them. White soldiers mocked them, and newspapers often ignored their valor. But they endured, driven by pride in their uniform and in themselves. When the frontier finally closed, the Buffalo Soldiers remained, symbols of loyalty and perseverance in a nation that seldom returned their respect. They stood as living proof that patriotism could coexist with pain, and that true courage meant fighting not only enemies across the plains, but injustice within one's own homeland. Long before the myth of the American cowboy galloped across the screen of history, the real horsemen of the West already rode beneath the burning Mexican sun. They were the vaqueros, the first cowboys whose traditions, language, and skill shaped the frontier long before the U.S. flag reached it. The word vaquero came from vaca, meaning cow, and their craft was born from the great ranches of New Spain in the 1500s. Spanish settlers brought cattle, horses, and the art of ranching to the Americas, but it was the mestizo and indigenous horsemen of Mexico who transformed it into a lifestyle. They invented the tools, the techniques, and even the style that defined cowboy culture. The wide-brimmed sombrero to block the sun, the chaps, chaparreras, to protect their legs from thorny brush, and the lasso, lariata, the rope that turned chaos into control. These vaqueros worked vast ranchos that stretched across what is now California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, long before those lands bore American names. Their skill was legendary. They rode wild stallions, herded cattle through deserts and rivers, and turned the raw wilderness into a world of order and rhythm. Their music, the corridos, told stories of bravery and heartbreak. Their code of honor valued loyalty, endurance, and respect for the land. When Anglo settlers arrived later, they borrowed everything: the gear, the words, even the swagger, yet rarely gave credit to the men who taught them. The vaquero spirit was not about fame or fortune. It was about mastery and pride. They lived by a saying, "Mas vale morir con honor que vivir con miedo." Better to die with honor than live in fear. They were not just cowhands. They were artists of the saddle, poets of motion, whose legacy bridged two worlds, the Spanish past and the American future. Every cowboy who rode the plains after them carried a piece of their shadow, whether he knew it or not. The border between the United States and Mexico was never merely a line on a map. It was a living scar, carved by war, greed, and migration. In 1846, when the U.S. Mexican War erupted, the frontier became a battleground. The war ended 2 years later with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, forcing Mexico to surrender half its territory, lands that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and Texas. Overnight, thousands of Mexican citizens found themselves foreigners in their own homeland. They were promised citizenship, but racism and violence quickly stripped them of their rights. Their ranches were seized, their language mocked, their culture dismissed. Yet borders could not contain identity. Mexican traditions continued to flow north. Food, language, music, and faith blending into a new frontier culture. The architecture of adobe houses, the rhythm of mariachi, the devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe, all endured, merging with native and Anglo influences. Even the legendary cowboy songs, the trail ballads, carried echoes of Mexican corridos that sang of love, betrayal, and defiance. But the border was also a place of blood. Bandits, rebels, and vigilantes roamed the Rio Grande. Groups like the Texas Rangers, praised as heroes by some, often acted as executioners, terrorizing Mexican communities in the name of law and order. Meanwhile, resistance movements like Las Gorras Blancas, the Whitecaps, rose in New Mexico, fighting back against Anglo land barons who fenced the open range. This clash of cultures produced both tragedy and transformation. The frontier became a crucible where identities melted and reformed. Mexican, Native, and American threads weaving together into the fabric of the modern West. The borderlands were not just a dividing line. They were the heartbeat of two nations learning, painfully and beautifully, to coexist. Out of centuries of conquest, migration, and survival, the American Southwest emerged as something entirely unique, a land where cultures did not merely collide, but intertwined. From the deserts of Sonora to the mesas of New Mexico, every sunset carried a story told in three languages: Spanish, English, and the silent whispers of the indigenous earth. The people who lived there, the Tejano, Californios, and Nuevo Mexicanos, became the bridge between two worlds. They spoke Spanish in their prayers, English in their trade, and Apache or Navajo in their friendships. Their food mixed corn and chili with beef and beans. Their music fused Spanish guitars with native drums. Their festivals celebrated saints and spirits side by side. This cultural fusion was not peace, it was balance. It grew out of struggle, adaptation, and endurance. Women in border towns wore shawls woven in traditional patterns while reading English newspapers. Men who once rode from Mexican ranchos now worked on American railroads. Yet through every change, the old rhythms remained. The dance of the jarabe, the toll of the mission bells, the taste of tamales cooked under the open stars. The Mexican frontier was not just geography. It was identity, fluid, defiant, alive. Its people refused to be erased by conquest or assimilation. They turned oppression into art, blending the sacred and the everyday into something entirely their own. When Hollywood later romanticized the West, it borrowed its color, passion, and mystery from these lands. But the real magic of the Southwest lies not in myth, but in memory, the memory of those who refuse to vanish. Their legacy survives in every cowboy's hat, every desert song, every cross standing on a lonely hill. It reminds us that the West was never just American. It was and remains a borderland of souls, forever divided, yet eternally connected. Before the hum of engines and the glow of electric lamps, the language of the frontier was written in steel and gunpowder. Technology, in its most primal form, came not from laboratories, but from the forge and the gunsmith's bench. And nothing changed the face of the American West more than two inventions: the Colt revolver and the Winchester rifle. These weapons were not merely tools of survival. They were instruments that shifted the balance of power across the plains. When Samuel Colt introduced his revolver in the 1830s, he gave a single man the firepower of 6. Before this, reloading a gun could take nearly a minute, an eternity in the chaos of the frontier. The Colt, with its revolving cylinder, could fire 6 shots in seconds, and its design spread like wildfire through the armies, lawmen, and outlaws of the West. It became known as the Peacemaker, an ironic title for a weapon that drew more blood than any before it. To the cowboy, it was protection. To the outlaw, power. To the lawman, justice. Then came the Winchester repeating rifle, the gun that truly tamed the frontier. Its lever-action design allowed a skilled shooter to fire 15 rounds without reloading, a miracle of mechanics in an age of black powder. Native warriors called it the gun that shoots forever. It was carried by buffalo hunters, ranchers, and settlers pushing westward, changing the very rhythm of conflict. Wars that once depended on numbers could now be decided by who held the latest weapon. The Colt and the Winchester turned survival into science, technology as destiny. Together, they became the twin symbols of the Wild West. One at the hip, one across the saddle, both shaping legends that would echo long after the smoke cleared from the battlefield and the prairie wind carried their sound into eternity. While guns roared and horses thundered, quieter revolutions were taking place. Inventions that didn't kill, but connected, controlled, and conquered. In 1861, a thin wire stretched from Missouri to California, the Transcontinental Telegraph, and within days, the West was no longer silent. For the first time, messages could travel faster than the fastest horse. The phrase "manifest destiny" found new life in electric sparks that bridged thousands of miles in seconds. Towns that once felt like islands in the wilderness were suddenly linked to Washington, New York, and the world. News, orders, and even love letters rode invisible currents through the sky. Then came a simple yet world-changing invention: barbed wire. Before its arrival in the 1870s, the plains were open and endless. Cattle roamed free, and disputes were settled by bullet and bravery. But when Joseph Glidden patented his twisted strands of wire, everything changed. The barbed wire fenced the horizon, dividing land into property and ownership. It ended the era of open range and began the age of control. Cowboys who once rode across boundless land now found themselves hemmed in by fences. Ranch wars erupted, blood was spilled, and freedom became a commodity measured in acres. And beneath it all steamed the iron heartbeat of progress, the locomotive. Steam power turned wilderness into civilization. The train carried goods, settlers, and dreams, while the telegraph sent their words ahead of them. Technology was no longer a luxury. It was a weapon of transformation. The West, once defined by distance, was shrinking. The frontier was being consumed not by war, but by wires, wheels, and the hum of progress. The same forces that connected men also divided them, as technology rewrote the laws of power, property, and progress forever. The closing decades of the 19th century saw the West transformed not only in landscape, but in spirit. The tools that once symbolized independence began to bind humanity to industry. Machines replaced muscle, and progress became both miracle and menace. The blacksmith's forge gave way to factories, and the cowboy's lasso was rivaled by the railworker's wrench. Technology, once the companion of survival, became the architect of domination. For the native nations, it meant a cruel shift in warfare. The same rifles that had defended buffalo hunters now armed the soldiers who slaughtered the buffalo themselves. Gatling guns, the first rapid-fire weapons, turned battlefields into massacres. The Sioux, Apache, and Comanche, armed with courage and old rifles, faced an army of iron and steam. The drumbeat of war was replaced by the clatter of machines. Resistance, no matter how brave, could not compete with the relentless march of mechanized power. But technology was also a lifeline. Steam plows tilled the plains, telegraphs brought markets to ranchers, and windmills pulled water from dry earth. The same frontier that had once been shaped by sweat now pulsed with invention. Yet beneath the triumphs lay an unease, the sense that something sacred was slipping away. The old rhythm of man and nature was drowned beneath the whistle of trains and the hiss of steam. The West had been conquered not only by guns and greed, but by gears and gears of progress. By the dawn of the 20th century, the frontier was no longer a wilderness, but a workshop. The campfire gave way to the engine, and the horse to the locomotive. The soul of the West, free, untamed, and infinite, was being boxed and sold in the name of civilization. Technology had delivered comfort, but also consequence. The same tools that built the future had buried the past. Yet somewhere beyond the fences and the wires, the wind still carried the echoes of hoofbeats, reminding the world that progress may move forward. But the frontier, once lost, never truly dies. The gold rush had set the spark, but soon the fire spread across the entire West. From the mountains of Colorado to the deserts of Nevada, the promise of silver, copper and gold turned barren wilderness into feverish colonies of men chasing fortune. These makeshift settlements began as tents and timber shacks, but grew overnight into roaring boom towns, chaotic cities where greed and glory danced on the same street. Men came from everywhere: America, Europe, China, and Latin America. Their picks struck stone by day, and their coins struck tables by night. Towns like Virginia City, Deadwood, and Leadville rose out of dust, glowing like beacons of opportunity. Streets echoed with hammers and horses, and saloons glowed like sanctuaries of sin. For every man who found gold, 100 more found only hunger and dust, yet none dared to leave, because hope glittered brighter than failure. Life was fast, lawless, and fleeting. Every payday turned into a festival of whiskey, cards, and women, and every morning brought fights, hangovers, and funerals. Churches stood beside brothels, and preachers prayed over men who died with dice in their hands. The boomtown was a paradox, civilization's frontier and its undoing. The rich built opera houses and banks, while the poor built dreams they could not afford. Entrepreneurs arrived too, selling boots, liquor, and lies. Miners dug deeper, chasing veins that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. But beneath the chaos, the boomtown represented something quintessentially American: the belief that tomorrow might be better, that wealth could be earned by courage alone. They were places born from hunger, sustained by hope, and doomed by greed. And when the gold ran out, silence moved in, heavy, hollow, and absolute. The moral pulse of the boomtown was as unpredictable as the mines that fed it. Where there was gold, there was temptation. Where there was loneliness, there was sin. Gambling halls became cathedrals of chance, their air thick with cigar smoke and desperation. Roulette wheels spun while fortunes rose and fell in the blink of an eye. Poker, faro, and blackjack ruled the night, and with every losing hand, another dream slipped away. Men killed for debts of $10, and sheriffs buried them with prayers they didn't believe in. Behind the saloons, brothels flourished under flickering lamplight. Women came to the frontier for the same reason as men: survival. Some sought freedom from poverty or abuse. Others were sold or deceived into lives of servitude. They were mothers, daughters, and survivors, living on the margins of man's world. Many became legends in their own right. Women like Madame Mustache, Big Nose Kate, and Fanny Porter, who ran their establishments with iron discipline and softer compassion than the law ever offered. In their own way, they provided community where none existed. Vice was not hidden in the West. It was celebrated. The frontier had no patience for hypocrisy. Saloons offered whiskey strong enough to burn the soul, and theaters staged bawdy songs instead of sermons. Even as reformers arrived, trying to civilize the towns, they often failed. Morality and sin coexisted like two gamblers at the same table, each cheating the other in turn. Yet beneath the chaos was something deeply human, a raw, unfiltered expression of need. These were not just dens of corruption. They were mirrors of the human heart, showing that the same hunger that built fortunes could also destroy them. The boomtown was not just a place. It was a fever, a brief flash of light before the long shadow of decline. Every boom ends the same way, with silence. When the mines went dry, when gold veins turned to dust, the crowds vanished as quickly as they came. Saloons emptied, streets echoed with wind, and once bustling towns fell into ghostly decay. The same wooden facades that once rang with laughter and gunfire now creaked in the desert wind. Ghost towns like Bodie, Rhyolite, and Jerome stood as hollow reminders of ambition's price. Windows shattered, churches rotted, and tumbleweeds rolled through streets that had once carried stagecoaches and dreams. But within that silence lay haunting beauty. The West seemed to reclaim what men had stolen. Coyotes prowled through abandoned stores. Dust-covered poker tables left mid-hand, as if time itself had fled. The miners' boots, the women's mirrors, the saloon's piano, all became relics of a brief, burning age. Some said these towns were cursed, haunted by the ghosts of those who died chasing fortune. Others saw them as sacred, monuments to the power and folly of human desire. The transformation from boomtown to ghost town told the story of the West in miniature: rise, glory, and inevitable decline. Yet even in their ruin, these places whispered lessons. They reminded America that progress without purpose breeds emptiness, that every dream carries a cost. In the 20th century, tourists would wander through the ruins, taking photographs and marveling at the stillness. They called it history, but to the wind and the sand, it was simply the world reclaiming balance. The silence after the rush was not death. It was memory, echoing through broken windows and cracked saloon doors, whispering that nothing built on greed can last forever. Before the glow of cinema screens, before the silver star of Hollywood rose, the Wild West was first built on paper, in dime novels printed on cheap pulp and sold for a nickel at train stations and general stores. In the late 19th century, these little books became the heartbeat of American fantasy, transforming ordinary frontiersmen into heroes and villains larger than life. Real men like Wild Bill Hickok, Buffalo Bill Cody, and Kit Carson were rewritten into flawless warriors. Fearless, moral, invincible. The violence and poverty of frontier life were scrubbed away, replaced by heroic duels, Indian chases, and noble quests for justice. The truth didn't sell, but the myth did. The writers of these novels often had never set foot west of the Mississippi. They wrote from imagination and rumor, shaping a West where good always triumphed, where lawmen stood tall, and where every outlaw was destined for redemption or a bullet. Audiences devoured these stories, hungry for adventure in an industrial world that was rapidly losing its wilderness. Heroes wore white hats, villains black. The complexities of the real West, the diversity, the injustice, the greed, vanished beneath a fog of romanticism. Native Americans were reduced to caricatures, women to damsels, and the land itself to a backdrop for white conquest. Yet these stories had power. They created a national identity, one where courage, self-reliance, and freedom were sacred. Even as telegraphs replaced campfires, readers believed the West was still out there, waiting to be rediscovered. The dime novel didn't just entertain, it rewrote memory. It blurred fact and fiction so deeply that, to many Americans, the myth became the truth. The legend of the West had begun, not on horseback, but in ink and imagination, where fantasy galloped faster than any real man ever could. When the 20th century dawned, the Wild West was already fading, but in dark theaters across America, it was being reborn in light. The new invention of motion pictures gave life to the old myths of the frontier. Silent films like The Great Train Robbery, 1903, turned outlaws into icons and gave audiences a thrilling new way to dream. Cowboys galloped across vast painted backdrops, bullets flashed, and justice was served in 20 minutes of pure drama. The camera replaced the campfire, and Hollywood became the new storyteller of the American West. The early Westerns were simple morality plays, black and white, good versus evil, but they captivated the world. Directors like John Ford and actors like John Wayne, Gary Cooper, and Clint Eastwood would later elevate the genre into legend. Films such as Stagecoach, 1939, High Noon, 1952, and The Good, The Bad and the Ugly, 1966, didn't just entertain, they defined masculinity, courage, and the very idea of American heroism. The cowboy became a timeless symbol, stoic, just, and self-reliant. Yet behind the glamour lay distortion. Native Americans were still portrayed as faceless enemies, women as prizes to be won, and the frontier as empty land waiting for civilization. The camera often turned tragedy into triumph, painting conquest as destiny and violence as virtue. The real people, the Mexican vaqueros, the black cowboys, the native defenders, were erased from the frame. Still, audiences didn't question. They believed. Hollywood's magic was so strong that the myth became history itself. But these films also carried something deeper, a yearning for freedom, for simplicity in a complex modern world. Even as cities grew and machines ruled, the cowboy's image offered nostalgia for a time when one man, one horse, and one gun could define justice. The Western film became America's mirror, reflecting not just who it was, but who it wished to be. By the mid-20th century, Hollywood's version of the West had become the world's version. Across continents, children wore toy six-shooters and shouted "Yeehaw" as they played heroes born from American screens. The cowboy, once a tired laborer, was now immortal, a global icon of freedom and rugged individualism. But this glamour came at a cost, truth itself. Hollywood had rewritten the past, turning colonization into courage and tragedy into entertainment. Films rarely showed the stolen lands, the massacres, or the despair of native nations confined to reservations. They ignored the Chinese laborers who laid the railroads, the Mexican ranchers whose lands were seized, and the black cowboys who rode beside white ones. Instead, they offered a clean, heroic myth, a West where moral clarity reigned and the good guys always won. For decades, this myth became America's most powerful export, shaping global culture, politics, and even national pride. Yet over time, cracks began to show. By the 1960s and 70s, filmmakers like Sergio Leone, Sam Peckinpah, and Arthur Penn began to deconstruct the old legends. Their revisionist westerns showed the grit, greed, and grief beneath the glory. Movies like The Wild Bunch and Little Big Man dared to ask uncomfortable questions about violence, justice, and guilt. The hero was no longer perfect. He was human. The myth, finally, was being challenged by truth. Still, Hollywood's West endures. Even today, new generations revisit it in films, games, and art, searching for meaning in the dust of old dreams. The legend refuses to die because it speaks to something universal, our desire to believe that somewhere beyond the edge of civilization, freedom still waits. But perhaps the truest freedom lies not in the myth, but in remembering the people and the pain behind it. The real West was never black and white. It was every shade of humanity, riding under the same burning sky. Before the settlers came, the Great Plains stretched endlessly, a living ocean of grass, alive with the thunder of buffalo herds that numbered in the tens of millions. For centuries, the buffalo, or bison, had been the heartbeat of the land. They shaped the soil, fed the wolves, and sustained the native nations who lived in harmony with them. Every part of the animal was sacred: meat for food, hide for shelter, bone for tools, and spirit for ceremony. To the Plains tribes, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet, the buffalo was not a beast, it was a brother. But when the frontier opened and the railroads stretched westward, a new kind of hunter came. Men armed, not with reverence, but with greed. By the 1870s, industrial slaughter had begun. Buffalo hides became leather for machines and belts for factories in the East. The U.S. government, seeing that native resistance depended on the buffalo, turned a blind eye, even encouraged the killing. Trains brought tourists who shot from windows for sport. Carcasses littered the plains, rotting under the sun, bones stacked like monuments to cruelty. In less than 20 years, the herds were gone. From 50 million, fewer than 1,000 survived. For native peoples, it was not just the loss of food, it was the destruction of identity. The buffalo was their sustenance, their economy, their spirit. Its extinction was an act of war disguised as progress. The prairies, once teeming with life, fell silent. The grass grew wild, but the heart of the land stopped beating. The slaughter of the buffalo marked the first great ecological disaster of the American West, a wound so deep that its echo still trembles through history, reminding us how greed can kill not only creatures, but cultures. As the West filled with settlers, the land that had stood untouched for millennia was forced to serve the ambitions of man. Rivers that once flowed freely were dammed, diverted, and drained to feed farms and mining camps. The mighty Colorado River, once carving its way through canyons to the sea, was shackled into irrigation canals and reservoirs. The balance between land and water, sacred to indigenous peoples, began to collapse. Deforestation stripped hills bare, and mining turned streams into veins of poison, heavy with mercury and arsenic from gold extraction. The railroads, hailed as the veins of progress, cut scars across the wilderness. They tore through forests, tunneled through mountains, and divided animal migration routes that had existed for centuries. The whistle of the train became the song of a new age, but it drowned out the music of nature. The iron horses brought cattle, commerce, and chaos. Herds trampled the grasslands into dust. Ranchers, in their hunger for profit, overgrazed the plains, destroying the delicate ecosystems that had thrived for thousands of years. The prairie, once alive with buffalo, wolves, and wildflowers, became a wasteland of fences and bones. Even the air began to change. The black smoke of steam engines mixed with dust storms rising from overworked soil. Settlers called it the price of progress. Native peoples called it imbalance, the breaking of the sacred circle. They understood that the earth was not an enemy to be conquered, but a relative to be honored. But few listened. By the dawn of the 20th century, the damage was done. The rivers still flowed, but slower. The land still stood, but weaker. Humanity had learned to master nature, and in doing so, had begun to forget how to live with it. Yet from destruction came awakening. As the 19th century closed, a few voices began to rise against the roar of industry, crying out for the land that had given everything and received only scars. John Muir, the Scottish-born naturalist, walked the mountains of California and wrote with holy reverence about their majesty. In every walk with nature, he said, one receives far more than he seeks. His words inspired a movement, the idea that the wilderness had value beyond profit, that it was a cathedral, not a quarry. With Muir came allies like Theodore Roosevelt, the cowboy president who hunted yet loved the wild. Together, they helped establish national parks, sanctuaries where the earth could heal. Yellowstone, Yosemite, Sequoia, and others became sacred spaces for the modern age. It was the birth of conservation, a recognition that the frontier's conquest had to be balanced with care. Scientists and explorers began studying the damage. The disappearing species, the eroding soil, the poisoned streams, and for the first time, America paused to consider the cost of its progress. But conservation was not without contradiction. Many of the parks were created by pushing out the very native peoples who had lived in harmony with those lands for generations. Even in saving nature, the old injustice persisted. Yet something new had begun, a change in consciousness. The same land once trampled by greed began to be seen as sacred again, not through religion or myth, but through respect. The frontier, though gone, left behind a legacy of lessons that no civilization can endure if it destroys the ground beneath its feet. The conservation movement became the modern West's redemption, proof that even after the fires of conquest, the spirit of the earth can still whisper forgiveness to those willing to listen. The dawn of the 20th century found the native nations battered but unbroken. Their land had been stolen, their people scattered, their children taken to schools designed to erase them. Yet still, the heartbeat of their ancestors endured. On the reservations, where poverty and isolation reigned, a quiet determination took root. They farmed dry soil, built churches and schools of their own, and began to blend the modern world with the memory of the old. Elders continued to teach the sacred stories in secret, whispering them to grandchildren by firelight, ensuring that the old songs would never be lost. The American government had promised protection, but what it offered was bureaucracy. Tribal councils became tools of control under the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which gave some autonomy, but tied it to federal oversight. Still, within this flawed system, a new generation emerged, one educated in white schools but raised on native pride. They wore two worlds on their shoulders, learning English by day and ceremony by night. World War II brought unexpected change. Thousands of native men enlisted to fight overseas. Warriors once again, now in the uniforms of a nation that had once sought to erase them. Their bravery, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, earned respect. The Navajo code talkers became legends, using their language as an unbreakable military code that helped win the war. When they returned, they carried a new kind of strength, the belief that if they could serve their country abroad, they could demand justice at home. The 20th century became an era of rebirth through endurance. The people who had been told to vanish refused. They adapted without surrendering. They were no longer warriors of the plains. They were teachers, activists, artists, and dreamers, reclaiming identity from the ruins of conquest. The story of survival was evolving into a story of renewal, a phoenix rising from centuries of ashes. By the 1960s, the fire of rebellion that had swept across the world reached the reservations and native communities of America. Inspired by the civil rights movement and fueled by generations of injustice, native activists began to rise and demand not charity, but sovereignty. They called it the Red Power movement, a cry for recognition, dignity, and control over their destiny. Their message was clear: we are still here. In 1968, the American Indian Movement, AM, was born in Minneapolis, founded by leaders like Dennis Banks, Russell Means, and Clyde Belcourt. They began by patrolling streets to protect Native people from police brutality, but their mission quickly grew into something far larger. Protests erupted at government offices, marches filled the streets, and sacred lands were reclaimed in symbolic defiance. The world began to see the faces and hear the voices of a people long silenced. The movement's defining moment came in 1973, when AIM occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota, the same site where, 83 years earlier, hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children had been massacred. For 71 tense days, activists held the ground, surrounded by federal agents. The world's media turned its cameras to that frozen prairie, where the ghosts of the past seemed to rise once more. "We are not vanishing," they said. "We are returning." Though the standoff ended in arrests and bloodshed, it reignited Native pride across the continent. Art, music, and literature blossomed. Tribal governments fought for land rights, language preservation, and environmental justice. The Red Power era was not just protest, it was prophecy fulfilled. The children of Sitting Bull and Geronimo had found their voice again, and they were speaking not in anger alone, but in remembrance and rebirth. The movement marked a turning point, the beginning of the Native Renaissance in full flame. From the embers of protest rose a new dawn, a renaissance not of war, but of words, art, and spirit. Across America, Native voices began to reclaim their place in history. Writers like N. Scott Momaday, who won the Pulitzer Prize for House Made of Dawn in 1969, reintroduced the world to Native storytelling, lyrical, spiritual, and timeless. His success inspired a generation of poets, novelists, and historians. Leslie Marmon Silko, Joy Harjo, Sherman Alexie, each carrying ancestral memory into modern form. Their words became medicine for the wounds of history, healing through beauty and truth. Meanwhile, Native languages once banned in schools began to rise again. Elders recorded songs and oral histories. Schools on reservations began to teach children their own tongues. Ceremonies long outlawed, the sun dance, the ghost dance, the sweat lodge, returned under open skies. Powwows blossomed as symbols of unity, bringing together tribes once divided by borders. The drums beat not as calls to war, but as rhythms of rebirth. In art and film, Native creators shattered stereotypes. Painters like Fritz Scholder and filmmakers like Sterling Harjo brought complexity and authenticity to a culture that Hollywood had once flattened. The world began to listen differently, no longer to myths of savagery, but to stories of survival and grace. Even in politics, a new era dawned. Native leaders entered Congress, scholars led universities, and activists fought for sacred lands like Standing Rock, where the old struggle, the defense of water and earth, once again united generations. The Native Renaissance is not a movement that ended. It is one that continues to grow, flowing like the rivers their ancestors once protected. From the ashes of conquest, they rebuilt not just culture, but identity. Their survival became victory. Their memory became power. Today, when the drum beats and the eagle circles overhead, it is not just a song. It is history speaking, alive again, whispering to the modern world that the First Nations of America never disappeared. They endured, adapted, and rose, stronger, wiser, eternal beneath the same sun that once shone over the old frontier. More than a century after the last cattle drives disappeared into history, the Cowboys still rides, not across open prairies, but through arenas packed with cheering crowds. The modern rodeo is the living heartbeat of an old legend. It began as simple ranch competitions, cowhands showing off their skills in roping, bronco riding, and bull wrestling. But over time, it evolved into a national spectacle, celebrating courage, precision, and the stubborn pride that defined the West. From Cheyenne frontier days to Calgary Stampede, the rodeo preserves more than sport. It preserves identity. Beneath the bright lights and dust clouds, riders prepare as their ancestors did, tightening saddles, whispering to horses, trusting instinct over fear. When a gate bursts open, time slows. 8 seconds on a bucking bull feels like eternity, a dance between balance and chaos, man and beast. Each fall, each triumph, is a reminder of the raw bond between human and nature that shaped the frontier. But rodeo culture is not just male and white. as Hollywood once imagined. Across the United States, Black, Latino, and Native cowboys and cowgirls reclaimed their place in history. The Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo, named after the African-American rodeo legend who invented bulldogging, celebrates their contributions long overlooked. In the Navajo Nation, rodeo is sacred, part sport, part ceremony, a symbol of endurance passed through generations. Women, too, have risen from the sidelines to the spotlight, dominating barrel racing and ranch events once reserved for men. Every rope thrown, every horse tamed, carries an echo of the old frontier, the courage to face the unknown and ride anyway. The rodeo, though now wrapped in banners and sponsorships, still holds the soul of the cowboy. Grit, grace, and an unyielding belief that even when thrown, you get back up and ride again. While the myth of the cowboy gallops through movies and parades, real cowboys still wake before dawn. Not to chase bandits, but to mend fences, tend cattle, and battle the quiet hardships of the modern ranch. Across Texas, Montana, Wyoming, and New Mexico, the open range has grown smaller, but the work remains the same. The world may have changed, but ranch life is still carved by weather, soil, and patience. Today's cowboys drive pickups instead of stagecoaches and use GPS and drones alongside lassos and horses. They balance heritage with technology, using satellite data to track herds and weather reports to plan movements. Yet even in the age of smartphones, the rhythm of their lives follows the sun, the seasons, and the stubborn reality that nature is always the real boss. Drought, wildfires, and climate change test them in new ways the old-timers never faced. But the essence remains unchanged. Hard work, loyalty, and love for the land. For many families, ranching is more than an occupation. It's legacy. Generations live on the same acres, carrying names carved into barn doors and graves alike. The cowboy code, honesty, resilience, and self-reliance, is passed from father to daughter, mother to son. Even as corporate farms rise and rural towns fade, the small ranch survives through faith and grit. Some modern cowboys fight not only nature, but bureaucracy, defending water rights, protecting endangered grasslands, and keeping alive the ethics of stewardship over exploitation. The cowboy's world is no longer wild, but it remains untamed at heart. Beneath every weathered hat is a quiet philosopher who understands what cities have forgotten. That freedom is not comfort, but connection to the soil, the sky, and the creature beside you that trusts you enough to run full speed into the unknown. From Tokyo to Paris, Buenos Aires to Dhaka, the image of the cowboy is everywhere, a symbol that has outlived the frontier itself. Movies, music, and fashion turn the cowboy into a universal myth. The lone rider, the rebel, the drifter who lives by his own code. To millions around the world, he represents freedom, that sacred independence of spirit that bows to no authority but conscience. Yet this global cowboy is not bound by geography. He rides through imagination. In Latin America, the spirit lives on in the gauchos of Argentina and the llaneros of Venezuela. In Mexico, the charros continue the vaquero traditions in colorful rodeos and parades. In Africa and Australia, herders on horseback echo the same rhythm, man and animal bound in partnership with the land. The cowboy has become a citizen of the world, his legend reshaped by every culture that touches it. But this global legacy is also reflection, both proud and painful. The myth celebrates courage, but often forgets conquest. It honors individuality, but erases the collective struggles of those left in the shadow of expansion. Yet even so, the symbol endures because it taps into something eternal. the human desire to roam free, to stand tall against injustice, to seek one's destiny under an open sky. In music, country and Western songs still echo the cowboys' loneliness and pride. In fashion, denim jeans and boots became global attire, born from necessity, now worn for identity. Even digital worlds, from video games to virtual realities, continue to recreate the endless horizon of the frontier where players ride again into dreams that never truly ended. The cowboy has become a myth beyond America, a reminder that wherever there is struggle and freedom, the spirit of the West still rides, forever chasing the sunset that never fades. The American West has always been more than geography. It is an idea, vast, untamable, and eternal. For centuries, storytellers painted it in bold strokes. Cowboys as heroes, Indians as villains, landscapes as empty stage sets awaiting civilization. But peel back the myth, and a different West emerges, one carved by struggle, coexistence, and sacrifice. The real West was not the work of a few brave gunmen or lone wanderers. It was a tapestry woven by millions: settlers, native nations, freed slaves, immigrants, women, and dreamers, all chasing survival under the same blazing sky. Behind every legend was a truth both harsher and more human. The cowboy's courage was often born from desperation. The outlaw's defiance was sometimes the rebellion of a man crushed by greed and law. The homesteader's triumph was built on the graves of buffalo and the displacement of tribes. Yet within those contradictions lay the essence of America itself. Ambition and guilt, beauty and brutality, coexistence and conquest. The frontier was never pure. It was always paradox. And still, the myth endures because it speaks to something deeper, the hunger to begin again. The West offered that illusion, that no matter who you were or what you had done, the horizon was wide enough to hold redemption. That belief shaped a nation's soul. It drove settlers to cross deserts, inventors to push technology, and writers to chase stories across time. The myth of the West is not about what truly happened. It's about what people needed to believe. And perhaps that, in itself, is its greatest truth, that the human spirit cannot resist the call of freedom, even when it comes wrapped in illusion. Long after the guns have fallen silent and the trails have vanished beneath highways, the land itself still remembers. The wind that sweeps across the plains carries whispers of buffalo herds that once darkened the horizon. The canyons echo with the voices of native prayers still rising toward the stars. The rivers, though dammed and diverted, still find their way back to the sea, as if the earth refuses to forget what it once was. Stand in Monument Valley at dusk, and you can feel it. The weight of time, the ghosts of cowboys and warriors walking side by side in shadow. The mountains do not care who won or lost. They simply endure, as they always have. The desert, once feared as empty, reveals itself as sacred, filled with the quiet power of things that outlast men. The true story of the West is written not in books or films, but in the soil, the bones, and the sky. Every scar, every fossil, every fading trail tells a piece of a human dream, of what it cost to build and what it cost to lose. For the native nations, the land was never a possession but a relationship, a living spirit, both mother and memory. For settlers, it became property, a thing to be owned, fenced, and sold. That clash between belonging and ownership defined the fate of the frontier. And yet, centuries later, the land remains the great equalizer. It swallows monuments and restores silence. The same sun that once watched over battlefields now rises on children of every color who play in fields that were once soaked in blood. The West reminds us that history is not buried. It breathes beneath our feet, eternal and alive. The frontier, they say, is closed. The maps are filled in. The wilderness has become a memory. Yet the spirit of the West still rides, not on horses across prairies, but in the hearts of those who refuse to accept limits. It lives in the innovators who carve new paths in science and art, in the activists who fight for justice and the earth, in the dreamers who still look toward the horizon and whisper, there must be more. The legacy of the West is not a time or a place. It is an attitude, the belief that no frontier, physical or spiritual, is ever truly beyond reach. But the modern world must also learn from its past. The same courage that built the frontier must now protect what remains of it. The rivers, the forests, the sacred sites, they're not just history, they're inheritance. The Old West teaches both pride and humility. Pride in human endurance, humility before the forces that shape us. The cowboys' grit, the natives' wisdom, the immigrants' hope. These are the true treasures of the West, far richer than gold or land. As the credits of history roll across the great sky, one truth remains. The West was never a story of endings, but of continuance. It belongs not to the past, but to anyone brave enough to seek new horizons and wise enough to honor the old. The dust has settled, but the echo of hoofbeats remains, drifting through canyons and cities alike. Somewhere, beyond the noise of the modern world, the spirit of the frontier still waits, not as a myth, but as a mirror, asking each of us the same eternal question. What will you do with your freedom? Today, you have journeyed through the dust and the legend, through courage and cruelty, freedom and loss. You've seen how the frontier was not just a place, but a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of the human soul. We rode beside pioneers and warriors, dreamers and survivors. We watched the buffalo vanish, the railroads rise, the cities fall, and the people who were never meant to vanish rise again, stronger than ever. The story of the West is not about guns or gold. It is about endurance, about people who refuse to surrender to time or tragedy. From the vaqueros of Mexico to the black cowboys of Texas, from the Lakota prophets to the women who tamed the wild, every one of them left a mark on the soil and the soul of America. The myth may fade, but the memory never will. And as we close this long ride through history, remember, the real frontier still lives inside us. Every choice we make between greed and grace, every fight for justice, every act of creation, that is the new West. We are all still riding towards something better, something freer. Thank you for traveling with History Teller YT, where the past speaks again, not in silence, but in story. If you felt the spirit of the frontier today, stay with us, because more untold histories await. Until next time, keep your heart wild, your mind open, and your spirit brave. For the echoes of the American West will never fade.